body. Would that be
Yes.
yes. Okay. She's there.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome. We're very pleased that you're able to join us. My name is Wes Rist. I am the Director of Education and Research here at the American Society of International Law. For those of you who are not familiar with the Society, we are a 108-year-old professional membership association, primarily international lawyers, but a growing number of cross-disciplinary and interdisciplinary members, as well as obviously international law is starting to touch on more and more different categories of practice around the world. We've been a nonprofit, non-advocacy group for all of our existence, and we're very pleased to be the kind of space where people can come to have very frank, forthright discussions about any possible concept of international law that you can think of. We have a wide variety of interest groups that cover just about every subject area, from international business and trade and commercial law, one of the things we'll be talking about tonight, to human rights, international humanitarian law, law of the sea and environmental law, space law, international law and technology, anything that you can think of that has a substantive element of international law involved. Not only do we have members who are interested, we probably have the world's leading experts as our members in that field as well. We also have several demographic interest groups, one of which is the co-sponsor of tonight's event, the New Professionals Interest Group. We have interest groups based around different geographic regions in the world. We have interest groups for minorities in international law, women in international law, disability rights, things like that. So it's a very wide and diverse membership. If you're interested in finding out more about the Society and joining, we have materials about membership downstairs. You're more than welcome to take with you. I have two specific things I want to point out. On Thursday, just 2 days from now, we're hosting another event that's free, open to anyone who wants to come, on strengthening compliance with international humanitarian law. The legal advisor of the Swiss Foreign Ministry is going to be here, along with a very stellar panel of people from the International Committee of the Red Cross, the academic community, the UN International Law Commission, to talk about generally the way states are complying with international humanitarian law obligations, and specifically ways that voluntary compliance can be improved, looking at, as an example, the Montreux document, which is focused on private military contractors. So if you're interested in those kinds of issues, this is a fantastic opportunity. The Swiss Embassy is sponsoring the event, so we'll have a very nice formal reception afterwards that you can come and take part in. So it's a great opportunity if you're interested. The last thing I want to mention is, on your chair, you'll see a flyer about this. This is our career guide. We've been publishing this for over 15 years. The newest edition came out last year. There will be a new edition next year. It's updated every other year. In the career guide, there is in the back about a collection of about 200 and so internships, fellowships, writing competitions, and moot court competitions that are all focused on international law. So if you're interested in ways to be developing your expertise and skills, this is something that has some specific resources for you. The front 2/3 of it are step-by-step guides for people that are interested in growing their professional development in international law. So it answers questions like, what should I be working on when I'm in one job but want to be preparing for an international career? Or if I'm a current student, how do I decide where to spend my summers, or what kind of volunteer work to do, or what kind of research and writing projects to take on in order to pursue an international law career? So it's a very valuable resource. The flyer there has information about it, as well as the website where you can find out how to purchase it. The display copy is downstairs as well, so you can take a look at that. That's all the time I want to take up. I do want to mention for our live streaming audience, as it says on the website, if you have any questions, email them to events@asil.org. That's events@asil.org. I will be able to read those off to our panelists once we hit the question and answer time. And I will turn it over to Kathleen.
Thanks, Wes. And on behalf of the New Professionals Interest Group, as Wes mentioned, I'd like to welcome you all. I'm so delighted to see you all here. And I want to thank our distinguished panel for joining us today and making time in your busy schedules to be here. I have some interest in the panel myself, in that my side job, when I'm not the co-chair of the New Professionals Interest Group, is working at the United States Trade Representative, a place where I've just joined the team. And so I'm happy to speak with folks about that opportunity, and hopefully I'll add a few words here and there about how I'm finding that. And I see some folks here who are also coming from that side of town. The bios for our panelists are on your chairs, so you have those unless you're joining us online, but don't worry. We're going to take a moment now. I'd like to ask the panelists to tell us a little bit about the offices where they work. So you'll have their personal backgrounds there, but we'll take a moment to just hear a little bit about where you are now, and what your office does, generally speaking, if we can say that. So I know you cover a lot of things at the various offices where you work, but rather than me take the time to go through and introduce everyone, and we'll start with that question and hear a little bit more about what you all do. So I'll start with Justin and move down the line. Thanks.
Thanks. So I'm with the Department of Justice in the International Trade Field Office in New York. We would represent U.S. Customs and Border Protection as well as the Department of Commerce in customs and trade disputes before the Court of International Trade, which is located in New York. The Department of Justice has two offices that focus on international trade and customs. We're split between Washington, D.C. and New York City. I'm currently on detail away from the International Trade Field Office to the United States Trade Representative, their Interagency Trade Enforcement Center, as well as the Office of General Counsel. So for the last year, I've been at USTR. In terms of my day at New York, it's solely based on federal litigation. So as I mentioned, we'd be either in court or proceeding through the steps of federal litigation, from the filing of a complaint through the appeal stage. We can talk about more of that as the panel progresses. At USTR, my focus is again on dispute settlement. So it would be representing the United States in international trade disputes under free trade agreements, essentially, is what one aspect of USTR handles.
Thanks. Scott.
Yes. My name is Scott McBride. I have been 14 years now with the Department of Commerce. I'm in an office that's called the Office of the Chief Counsel for Trade Enforcement and Compliance. A year ago, it was the Office of the Chief Counsel for Import Administration, so everything's changed. But what we do is essentially the same thing, which is anti-dumping and countervailing duty law. What happens is basically a party will come in and claim that either a company in, let's say, China, for example, has sold merchandise below the cost of production in the United States. If so, we'll investigate that over a year's time. That's called dumping. Or they've subsidized, China has subsidized that industry to the disadvantage of U.S. industries. That's called countervailing. And if we find that there is subsidies in violation of international laws, then we apply duties on that called countervailing duties. So what we'll do is we'll first counsel. My day-to-day life is 50% of it working on these investigations and reviews. Sometimes I get to go overseas, which is fun. I've been to Japan and China and Thailand and Mexico and Canada. We get to go across overseas and check the books and records of these companies that are participating in investigations and reviews. We conduct these investigations and reviews, come to determinations, and I'm counsel on those. So we have preliminary decisions and final decisions. I advise them and work with the teams throughout all of that. Well, inevitably in our area, it's fraught with litigation, as Justin was mentioning. And so what will happen is once it gets to litigation, there's different avenues of litigation. It might go to the Court of International Trade, where I will get the case and I'll have to go ahead and write the briefs defending it, send it over to justice. The justice lawyer may decide, hey, this is great, and file it as is. The justice lawyer may say, I'm going to revise this whole thing, and that's their priority. And then we'll work together on that and file it and then go and argue at the Court of International Trade. That might get to appeal, and if it does get appealed, then we go to the Court of Appeals for the Federal Circuit. It may also happen that it goes in front of NAFTA panels. I've argued, and that's when we argue ourselves. And I've been in front of 3 North American Free Trade Agreement panels. And then also we, of course, go to the WTO and the World Trade Organization. And we work with the USTR for complaints and arguments and all that goes in front of panels and the appellate body in Geneva, Switzerland. So that kind of summarizes. But it all comes out essentially out of dumping and countervailing duty law. Okay.
Emily?
Hi, everyone. My name is Emily Fuller, and I am an associate at Akin Gump, which is a law firm that has offices all over the world, but we have a DC office, which has a fairly big international trade practice. I've been at the firm for 2 years. I previously was on the Hill. I worked for the Senate Finance Committee and the international trade staff under Senator Orrin Hatch. Now I am mainly doing customs law work at our international trade practice. Our trade practice also has a fairly large export control component, as well as trade remedies, which does a lot of work with anti-dumping and countervailing duty law, as well as trade policy. And I also do some trade policy work because I worked on the Hill and I have a little bit of knowledge about free trade agreements. I was on the Hill when the three most recent free trade agreements were implemented, Korea and Panama and Colombia. So I do a lot of work mainly, like I said before, in customs law, though. We do, it's a plethora of different things. We do a lot of proactive work for clients, dealing with, compliance review of their current procedures and controls to ensure that they're doing their best to follow the regulations and laws they're required to when importing goods. This can range from if they're correctly classifying goods, if they are correctly valuing goods, if they are making claims under free trade agreements and have the correct documentation to back that up. So a lot of that, we do in a proactive manner, but we also obviously do a lot of reactive work when a client gets a notice from Customs and Border Protection, or what's known as a notice of action or request for information, or if they get a pre-penalty or a penalty notice. We often help them respond and do the legwork and the drafting and work with the agency to hopefully get as best a response from our client as possible. And then on the trade policy front, like I said, we do a lot of following of the current free trade agreements that are in negotiation, which is TTIP between the EU and US, as well as the TPP between a lot of the Asian Pacific countries and the United States and Mexico and Canada. And Akin actually does a lot of representation of sovereign nations and how those nations are following the ongoing trade agreements. So I do a lot of work on that front as well.
Thank you.
My name's Robert Chavette, and I work for the Office of Regulations and Rulings, which is in the Office of International Trade, which is part of CBP. It's funny, she mentions all that stuff, that working on protest and other stuff she does for her clients. She's probably dealing with somebody in our office. And we deal on the regulation side, where our office drafts regulations in 19 CFR that are customer related. And on the rulings, on the ruling side, we'll give things like advice to the ports regarding classification, valuation, or other customs related issues related to imports. Or I also do rulings, review protests by importers, and or penalty protests, or any importers can petition for things like if their merchandise was seized for an intellectual property violation, they can petition our office about the seizure. So we do a lot of rulings concerning various things that all have an importation as the nexus. Actually, a couple of our people work at, former customs people work at her office, and we have another person I work with now works in Justin's office. Actually got somebody from Commerce working for us.
Carrie, is Carrie your boss,
Yes.
actually?
No, not my boss.
Some of my office is his
Yeah.
boss now, so.
So a lot of people
Yeah.
from our office go out both to the private sector and other agencies. And sometimes they often go out in details as well.
Is Betsy Doyle in your office too?
Yes.
Yeah, okay, so two people from my office are in your
Oh, she's
office.
still there.
Jeez. Take a lot of people away.
Thanks. Well, and that's one thing I'm learning is the fluidity and the small world nature of this whole field. And so maybe that's one way to lead into the next question I wanted to ask you all. We have a lot of, I know, students and folks who are just out of school, and you're doing a lot of movement across these offices, but what originally motivated you to pursue a career in this area? Was it sort of happenstance, or was it that you wanted to do this from the minute you set foot in the law school as a 1L? For that, let's start with Emily, if you would.
So I kind of fell into international trade. I come from a fairly, active political family. I was always very much into politics, which is probably why I ended up in DC. I went to American University for undergrad, and I always, kind of considered a profession in law because I think it's a really, it's a dynamic field, and it's a lot of analytical thinking. It's challenging. So in that respect, I took some time off and I decided to go to law school, but I had no idea I wanted to do international trade whatsoever. But after law school, I ended up working up on the Hill, like I said before, for the Senate Finance Committee. And really the biggest need they had was in international trade. They needed the most help there. They had the oncoming free trade agreements that were being passed. by Congress at the time. GSP, which is known as the Generalized System of Preferences program. It's a program that other countries can get a trade benefit, a duty reduction in order to kind of help their development. A lot of African countries and Asian countries that are developing get those benefits. Anyways, that was coming up through Congress at the time. So they had a need for it. And I started working with the team, and I thought it was really very interesting. It's obviously a growing field. And as far as customs goes, they were also working on the customs reauthorization bill drafting at the time. And I was the main junior legal assistant who was working with the more senior counsel and helping them with research. So that really led me to get a bigger understanding of customs. And then, was looking for jobs specifically in customs practices. And that's how I found Akin Gump. And luckily I was offered a position. It's been a great job there. And one thing that's great about international trade, like everyone has kind of mentioned here, is that there's lots of nexuses between import and export work and policy and customs work and anti-dumping and countervailing duties and customs work. So at least at the law practice I'm at, I've got to do a little bit of everything, and I haven't been kind of pigeonholed. But so in other words, I guess the point is I didn't have any intention, but I fell into it, and it's just something where maybe you have to keep your eyes open. But it is a really interesting field of law to go into.
I knew I wanted to do trade law, not anti-dumping, but I was a Peace Corps volunteer in Central Africa. And while I was there, about 1 year through, the franc, which was the CFA, the French franc in Africa, was tied to the French franc up in France. And unilaterally, they had decided up in France that they were going to devalue the currency by half. And so overnight, essentially, we wake up and everything's twice as expensive. And it was pretty shocking, actually. But that also meant that it was really cheap for foreigners coming in. And within a few months, we started seeing all this development, like the roads were paved, which was a shocker. My little village, suddenly this like big, we got Japanese and German businessmen all coming through on these massive bulldozers and just putting down concrete. And it really changed the dynamics. And I thought, wow, this trade thing means a lot to a lot of people in a lot of ways. So then I went to law school. And when I was in law school, I learned that the most active area, the most contentious area was AD/CVD, anti-dumping countervailing, and that's where I learned about it. And when I got out, actually, that's where I was gearing for it. And my first job was not doing that, but I kept my eye on the ball, and then I got this job, and I've been there ever since. So.
Thanks. Justin, I'll turn to you next, but I wanted to ask you a specific question as well. That is, my law school didn't have a trade law class. Did yours? And is that something that motivated you to come in this area?
Mine did. I graduated from the Ohio State University, Moritz College of Law, and they had a certificate program in international trade, which is, I think, somewhat unique. I obtained the certificate, and that's sort of how I got my foot in the door with respect to trade. As part of that certificate program, I did a fellowship with the House Ways and Means Committee, Subcommittee on Trade, very much similar to what Emily did, but I was still in law school when I had that experience. So that was sort of my first exposure to trade law, was in the world of policy. During my third year of law school, I worked primarily for the U.S. Attorney's Office within Columbus, Ohio, and that was sort of my entrance into justice as a federal employee. After law school, I was in private practice for a couple years, but I wanted to get back to trade, so I applied for a clerkship with the U.S. Court of International Trade in New York. Obtained a clerkship there. From there, I transitioned over to the Department of Justice and have been there ever since. So I kind of had my start back in law school is when I first began my interest in trade.
Robert, we spoke briefly before the panel, both of us coming from Indiana University, different times, and whether something in Indiana motivated you, or you said you had a slightly different path of getting to customs.
Yeah, just kind of lucked out. I came from engineering science background, and I worked probably 7 years before law school in doing system engineering, network engineering during the, I guess you call it the Internet 1.0. And once that kind of went, that kind of crashed when I went back to law school. I thought I was going to be doing intellectual property law. I had passed the patent bar and was a registered patent agent while in law school, and I was doing some work along those lines. But then after law school, I ended up getting the job I did get was a clerkship for a magistrate judge in Richmond, and I was clerking there for 18 months, and then started applying for jobs up here, and interviewed with the DOJ in their tax section and a couple firms for IP, and then just happened just when I was online looking at jobs, TBP was taking applications, was hiring, so I applied. And then they called me up, interviewed me 2 days later, which was kind of unheard of.
The government? Yeah.
Yeah, they called me up 2 days later, said, "Can you come in the next day?" And then I was like, "Sure." So I came in, and they liked the fact that I clerked and also had an intellectual property background in science. And then I didn't hear from them for 8 months after that, actually. But they kept saying, we just haven't made decisions yet. And then that's kind of just fell into it, just kind of by luck. I never thought about it at law school. But before I interviewed them, I looked to make sure it was something that was interesting, and it did seem quite interesting and challenging. I always figured trade can only get bigger. I mean, and other things can boom and bust, like the internet and other real estate and everything else. But trade's always going to get bigger. Oh, they might slow down some here and there, and it seemed pretty interesting. It's kind of what makes the world go around in a way.
I think if I were not already working in this area, you would have sold me one of the things you all have already said. But tell us maybe a little bit more about some of the challenges, if you would, about being in this field. What things that you face, or the things maybe you didn't expect when you came into this field, in the various offices that you're in. What are the harder moments that you faced in various times in your careers? If you have any thoughts? Who wants to start this one? Scott?
Great.
He's looking this way.
Don't look at her.
I think this is now where I'm the old man on the committee, so I'm sorry about this, but the hardest part to me at this point in my life, because I'm a married guy, got 3 kids, is balance. That's really a problem that every lawyer has, no matter what their practice is. I think it's a harder job as a whole in law firms. The billable hour is demanding. I was in a firm as well before I came to Commerce, and that was before I had children. I was newly married. I just got married to start working for the firm. And I got used to having to work every Sunday, just because it was a matter of just getting my billables together, just doing, boring work as opposed to everything else. So I remember when I went to Commerce the first week, I got out and we went and did our thing in the morning, and then basically every afternoon we had a routine where I would go and I'd go to the office and I do work for a few hours, and my wife would, she said she'd take care of laundry and she'd do other stuff, and I stood there and I looked at her and I was like, I don't have to go to the office today. I'm in a new job. And she looked at me and she's like, I don't know what to do with you. So we went hiking, and we still remember that Sunday. Now, it's not that I haven't worked Sundays and I haven't worked weekends, and I actually have done a few all-nighters at this job over the 14 years. But I will say that comparing everybody I know that works for a law firm, comparing to the government generally, you do have less of an opportunity to have that type of social life, or to have that downtime with your children, if you've got kids, as I do, at the end of the day. Because a lot of my friends, I think all of my friends, quite frankly, that work for law firms, they'll work until the time where they come home and they eat, and they may have to go right back to work again. And it's the way the billable hour works. And firms do the best they can often to give a work-life balance, but it's still really difficult. Now, that being said, if you put away all of the family stuff and that weighing thing, I think probably the most complicated thing I found is trying to figure out a way to balance writing briefs on the litigation front with life. You may be very, very lucky and have 1 or 2 briefs due within a short period of time, and you can do those and they're easy. But you might get slammed with one that's got 10 issues. And if you've got 10 issues, brief is totally not the right word for it. It's not brief at all. I've written briefs that have been 125 pages, addressing just lots of things. And when you're addressing lots of things and you're working on a record, which is potentially thousands of pages of record that you're looking at and trying to decide how you're going to craft your arguments, it takes time. It takes a lot of time. And that takes away from the rest of your life and the rest of your work, because it's not as if when you're working on a brief that you don't have all the other demands you do from your job. And so when that happens, you just have to figure out a way to balance it. And usually it does mean weekends, and it does mean late hours, et cetera, to make sure that everything gets done. So I think that's the hardest part. What about you, Justice?
Well, I would say that the most challenging aspect of government service is actually one of the most rewarding, in that in working for the government, a lot of responsibility is placed upon your shoulders, which is one of the reasons why I pursued a career in federal service. When I joined Justice, one of the things that I quickly learned is you're very much responsible for everything that you do, and you have to be able to manage your docket and manage your cases on your own. I mean, there's really no support system for government attorneys in terms of having a large staff of paralegals or secretaries to assist you in that process. So you become really quite self-sufficient very quickly in government service. And I say that's one of the most enjoyable aspects of it, because of the amount of responsibility that you do have and the amount of opportunity that is afforded to you to engage in really, really interesting work. So both at USTR and DOJ, it can be very time consuming because you're doing all aspects of a case, from document management all the way through to the drafting of briefs. And so it can be challenging in managing the full spectrum of a case, but also rewarding.
Turn that question around there. Very good. Robert, did you want to speak to that? And I'll give Emily.
Sure. I kind of like what Justin said at my office. You're given a lot of autonomy to do your cases. When I started in tariff classification, I was given 20 cases, rulings to work on, and just like, here, do them. And luckily, most of them I didn't really have any specific deadlines, like do them in a week, but I could do them at my own pace, with the understanding that I needed to at least get something done every week, at least one, or every week and a half, and I could prioritize them like I wanted to, or whatever. And they give us also, I like having that autonomy to do that, get used to that. I heard, I don't know about firms so much. People who've gone to firms kind of miss having that I've talked to. And in our office, I mean, and this is all my personal opinion because I'm not supposed to be here officially, but our office, they're very helpful. The branch chiefs and everybody else, and people who've been there longer, who have subject matter expertise. If you have an issue or can't understand something, there's always somebody you can go there and ask and talk to. Everybody's doors open, and everybody's very helpful in getting things done. So I think with my office, the work-life balance is probably second to none. I can't think of any time we've ever really worked past 7.
All right, all applications to Robert.
But it's a good place to work.
Thanks. Well, yes, we have a lot of government representation here, and now we need to allow Emily a chance to respond on the private practice side, and both maybe the good and the bad, because now we've had a lot of comparison to private practice, but also Robert has a good reminder that none of our government folks are speaking in their official capacities today, and maybe probably Emily not either on behalf of the firm. So go ahead.
So I would agree with Scott that one of the hardest things at a firm is your work-life balance. I don't have any kids. I am married. And honestly, it's just kind of part of the game. And it's something that when you work at a law firm, it's kind of something you sign up for. And, life during the week is not really kind of like life in general. I mean, a lot of my friends work at nonprofits and other jobs, not to say those aren't hard jobs, because I know they are very hard because they're very understaffed a lot, but they often leave at 5:36, and that's not generally something that would happen in a law firm. So it's just kind of something you do take and you have to deal with. Weekends are oftentimes just something that sometimes you have to work, and that's just part of the game. I do think that one of the biggest pluses, at least that I've come across working at a law firm, is who I work for. I think that's very important when you're a young associate. I've been very lucky in that I really like working for the partners I work for, and they're very, they don't want to make your life miserable. They want you to have a life because they want you to be happy, because once you have the institutional knowledge of their clients, they want you to stay and work for them. So they have, there is a reason for you to be happy. So, I do think that the partners I work for are really great, and they understand when things come up. So that's obviously something you really can't control when you work at a firm, but I've been lucky in that sense.
Or at any job.
Yes, or any job, that's right, very much so. As far as the challenges of actually working in a law firm, maybe compared to a government agency, is you have so many different clients that you have to kind of put on a different hat every time you have a different client. A lot of times our work products are emails to our clients, short one-page memos. Clients who are busy, they don't have time to read a 20-page memo, and frankly, your partner doesn't either. So a lot of what I do is spending time editing what I write so that I can make it as clear and concise as possible for the partner to understand, and then also for the client to understand. And each client wants different things too, so a lot of it is trying to figure out, do they want this in a bullet point format, or do they want it in a memo? I mean, that sounds very small, but that is actually things that come up every day, because we are law firms are client services firms. So, and the partner wants to keep the client, obviously. It's really important, and you're kind of the person who helps them with that. So I think that's probably the hardest, thing is figuring out, and writing is extremely important in my field, and I think in every any lawyer, writing is probably the most important thing, and being a good writer and always working on your writing. So that's something I would suggest to anyone out there, because my partner, who's been in the field for I don't know how many years, a long time, but he still is always talking about how he needs to fix his writing. And so it's a good sign that, writing is something that is 100% very important to law.
Any responses? You all look like you were going to jump in on that.
Well, I think you're exactly right. I mean, the one thing we constantly strive for and push for is the most and best you can do within writing. We frequently get, and this will be one of your questions, so I'm just going to jump right into it. People say, what should we be looking for? What should we be doing when we interview or when we want a job? And I know for justice, and I know for the private firms, and for us too, writing is so important. And I cannot tell you how many times we've gotten writing samples and you find misspellings, or you find poorly written sentences, or you find citations that are done incorrectly. And I know that sounds like a weenie, but the truth is, it's true that this is what lawyers do. They look for those details. And so if we get a writing sample, or God forbid we get a cover letter, or even a resume, and there's misspellings, and it's incredible to me, because this is the one opportunity you have for within a 5-minute or less period of time to wow the person you want to get a job from. And if you have any misspellings or anything at all like that, I know everybody I know boots it. I mean, we say that's it. I mean, you cannot make a mistake in those things, because that is supposed to be the pinnacle. That's the best of you that you're giving to the potential employer. So
let me ask you a little more about that, if I may, and anyone else feel free to jump in too. Just in terms of think about people coming out of currently in law school or just out. What are some strategies for improving writing? Not just the cover letter, okay, you have a friend read it, or you make sure you run your spell checks and things like that, but what would you recommend, any of you, in terms of getting some good experience, or is there a particular book that folks should look at that was influential in your life as to improving your own writing?
I think for justice in particular, and litigation generally, persuasive writing is really it's a talent. And it's something that when we get the writing, because we do so much litigation, when we get a writing sample, we're looking for persuasive writing. And that's not something that a lot of people necessarily come out of law school knowing. I think that there are books. I think that there are lots of things that they can do. And maybe you have recommendations, but I do not. But I will say that knowing how to persuasively say something in as few words as possible is really a characteristic that not everybody has. But if they have it, it is something that's very, very much appreciated.
Thank you, by the way, Kathleen, for reminding me that we're all here in our individual capacities and not on our agencies. I'm obligated to throw that out there. I agree with everyone that writing is a continuous process from the time that you leave law school till the time, till death. I mean, I think you should always be working on your writing. It's always an evolving skill that everyone, I believe, can learn and grow. I also agree that the skill of getting the kernel or the essence of what you're trying to communicate across quickly and upfront is important, especially when the audience that you're speaking to doesn't have a lot of time. And you're going to find as your career progresses that that's more frequent, that people just don't have the time to assimilate large amounts of information. So my boss at DOJ always calls it, don't bury the lead. Like when you're sending an email, don't bury the lead, and keep your email short because people are very busy. But those little things you do learn over time, and it is a skill set to get the point quickly up front with the right amount of information that the person you're speaking to needs in order to make a decision or to understand the counsel and advice that you're providing. In terms of gathering that type of skill set, when you're in your first jobs out of law school or you're in those summer careers, when you're working for a partner or you're working at an agency and you're assigned a writing task, think about it as this is going to be my writing sample for a future job. And that's important because when you do get out of law school, that will be one of the essential components of your application. And if you're developing that work product early as it's occurring in that real life context, it's much easier when you then go on to apply for the job. You'll have that piece of writing there ready to provide to your employer. So keep that in mind, that as those first few experiences you have in law school, when you are assigned that task, to focus on it. And when you're working with the reviewer or the partner or the head of your agency that you're writing that product for, I'd even alert them to that at some point in time, that you want this to be your writing sample. So could they, give you any tips or advice, or if there's any good constructive criticism they have to make that writing or that work product better, it would be good to alert them so that way when you're finished with the project, it can be used in the future.
I know one trick I always use is after I write something and I've edited it once, to put it into Microsoft Word if it's an email or whatnot, and I always try and cut like half of it or like 30 words of it. And that sounds kind of like an odd task, but usually the person who I'm going to send that to could shorten it somehow by, just they can make it more concise. So that's one way I always try and make my writing more concise, is just focus on that little task. I think Redbook is one of the books that we utilize, some people at the firm utilize. And I think Elements of Style is the other one.
Oh yeah, that's right.
Yeah. But that's just one tip I use. One of the partners gave a writing seminar in the last few months, and they said you should, and I'm sure a lot of people have heard this before, but you should really block half of your time to editing that you use to write a document. So don't write something and have 5 hours and only have 30 minutes to edit it. You need more time than that. And I know sometimes it's not always possible. Oftentimes that's how it occurs with me as well, but editing is just as important and maybe more so important than the writing.
Robert, you've been in so many offices across customs as well. Is there an equal emphasis on writing in all of them? And things that you would take away from that?
Yes, there certainly is. I've been told to overwrite things because I don't know. I just tend to write a lot, and one of my previous branch chiefs always was saying, just cut it down some more. I think I just want to make sure I got everything in there. But I can say it was concise. It's just they were always, don't put any dicta in there. Is what I think, you got some dicta somewhere in there. Can you take it out? So that's just one of my things. I think it just came from the fear of law school tests or forgetting something. So I'd write everything in the test I could think of. And frankly, when I went to law school, because I came from engineering background, science, my writing really kind of, like a better term, sucked because I just did systems engineering programming before law school. I had to kind of relearn everything I learned in college and before in high school. I've come a long way in 10 years, I like to say. And practice. The only way to become a better writer is practice. If you're in law school, the more writing classes you take, I think the better. And the more you have a chance to do a longer paper or some sort of seminar paper, it teaches you research. I did a couple of those, and those were really helpful. It helped me focus on something that's 15, 20 pages long, because sometimes briefs and things you write are 15, 20 pages long. and you kind of have to have the endurance to write it, but also to go back and edit it. And I also learned, speaking of, two things, emails, I always, unless the email has to be sent right then, especially if it's a long one, I'll write it, put it away, and come back a couple hours later and reread it. And because I always know my first draft of any email is going to have typos or something in it that sounds awkward. So I reread emails, especially very important ones that the people that are definitely above me, many times before I send it. And I always recommend just doing that. And if you have the luxury of a little bit of time of looking at a draft, like your penultimate draft, put it away for a week and then come back and look at it. If you can do that, because there's been times I put stuff away for a week, thought it was perfect, and I just happened to come back a week or so later, and I'll catch where from is actually form. There's things that Word won't catch, but it just happens to be tucked away somewhere, and I catch little errors like that. But again, practice.
It's for that reason that if there's law review or journal experience, I very much appreciate that when I'm interviewing someone, because especially if they did a paper that was published, because that means they went through the whole process you're talking about of researching it and figuring it out and putting it together and editing it. And that's all a skill set. It really is.
Well, I want to turn to questions very shortly, so I hope you all are thinking about questions that you may have for the panel. We've talked about a lot of substance. We've talked also now about different strategies for moving into the field, coming out of law school and so forth. Let me just ask one more thing for anyone who wants to respond, and don't feel obligated before we open it up to the crowd. And that is, well, each of you spoke about the diversity of opportunities within the field. Government side, the private side, and everywhere in between, and even on a daily basis, you're doing a lot of very different and interesting things. Among all of that, again, if there were something that you could have known before you came into the field, is there anything in particular that you would recommend? We've talked about the writing practice, but something that you would have done differently, or a strategy that that would have worked for you maybe a little bit better coming into practice generally? Words of wisdom.
Well, I know something because our O&R is very import oriented. That's our focus, is imports. And we have a number of people in our office, a significant percentage, probably a quarter of them, that used to be customs brokers in a prior life before going to law school and then coming to work for customs, and then they work for other offices within CBP. And I look to what a customs broker does, if you're interested in international trade and importing. And it's or an our CBP employee, once we're employed by CBP, we can't take the custom broker's test. Perhaps it could be something, if I was a law student and I knew I really wanted to do customs, I think I probably would look into studying that and trying to take the exam to be a licensed customs broker, because then there's custom brokerage houses that would hire you, perhaps, if you have that. And also you could perhaps work for a customs broker if you, I guess we're in DC, at port of, say, Baltimore or wherever during the summer, or some other major port where a lot of customs brokerages are centered. That's one way. That's one thing I would look into. And look at the CBP website, and under the Office of International Trade, there's a lot of good information there.
I was just going to mention, if you have the ability, a lot can be gained by being able to work for a period of time in the private sector and a period of time in the public sector. Because so often attorneys, once they get into their chosen career field, will develop a practice, either public or private, and can oftentimes get siloed into that practice. And so much can be gained from both areas. People who are in government for an extended period of time may not understand the perspective of the private industry or the client that's coming to the government because they have an issue or they have a problem. And by working in the private sector, you can gain a lot of insight, and oftentimes disputes can get resolved perhaps in an amicable manner if you just have a different perspective or understanding of the problem. And I think the same tenet holds true for those in the private sector, is they may not understand the mechanisms of government and the different processes of review that government work entails. And so having that period of time in government service, if you are going to spend the majority of your career in private practice, I think that can be helpful. I know it's difficult because obviously getting a job is difficult, at any time. So what I say I know can sound a bit lofty, but to the extent that's possible, I would recommend it. For purposes of government careers, though, I would direct everyone to USA Jobs. That is the main hiring website for students coming out of law school or even practicing attorneys. And every position is posted on there. While it may seem like it's just this big website that your application goes into and you never hear back from, I know many, many people, that is the main source by which government agencies get their applications. So it's a great website. It also has the ability to filter through your searches so that you can tailor it to your specific interests. And they'll send you pings, these email pings on a daily basis of what agencies within that specific area or geographic location you're interested in become open. Because a lot of getting a job is just being ahead of the game and getting your application in there early. And either in private practice or in government service, and USA Jobs is a good portal to do that. Each individual agency generally has their employment opportunities also posted within like an HR link on the agency. So if you're diligent and you're looking at each particular agency, you will find that. But USA Jobs is a great clearinghouse for that.
Thanks. Well, I'd like to now open us up for questions, and I hope everyone's been thinking of what you want to ask. And no question is too small or too big, I think. Fair to say for the panel. If like me, you're still trying to figure out what is a countervailing duty, you can feel free to ask that question again. So questions, anyone? And Wes, you've got two online. All right, well, why don't we start with one of those?
Okay. So the first one we've got from that is, how necessary is law into getting into international trade? Somebody has got an MBA or master's in international trade, but not the JD. Are there jobs in this field that don't require the law degree?
Great question.
Well, the answer is yes, there is. And I mean, especially on the customs side, I think being a customs broker is a great thing. And I know a lot of people that have done that. One area that's growing too is supply chain management. I know it sounds like something you just you don't really what that means, but in the last 10 years, there's been I've been in this for 14 years, and I've seen a radical change where now it seems like anything that's produced in Vietnam has pieces that's also from China, that's also pieces of Philippines, and they hire people to actually make sure they recognize and they can manage where each one of these inputs come into so many things that come into the United States. And on the export side, I mean, you guys can speak more to it, I think, in the firm than I can, but there's a lot of jobs out there with regards to, on the export side, GE, I mean, and all the various big companies, they have a lot of expertise in the export side. And none of those jobs that I'm talking about are law-related jobs. They may touch in the law, they may deal with the law, but they don't necessarily require you be a lawyer. So
we're probably going to have to wait while Vice President Biden goes home. But during that time, the second question is, what would the advice be for a Latin American attorney with an LLM and experience as not-for-profit counsel at the OAS and the UN looking to get into international trade?
Can you say it one more time?
Sure. Advice for a Latin American attorney with an LLM with experience as not-for-profit counsel for the OAS and UN looking to get into international trade.
That is very specific.
So let's broaden it out to, can you transition from international organizations to international trade, or what would you suggest that transition?
you can answer that one.
Oh, that's right.
Go ahead.
I mean, I know that our firm we have a really big international trade policy practice. And kind of jumping off the first question, we have several international trade specialists who do not have law degrees, but deal with policy work. Like I said before, following agreements that are going on, trade issues that are going on the Hill, and obviously clients are interested in those sorts of things. As far as having expertise in a different country, it is a really valuable asset, especially if you speak a different language, I think. I know we're always looking for people, there's always blasts going out. Can someone translate this? Can someone speak this language? And I know that they brought in some like shorter term, I guess I would say clerks who've had experience, who have LLMs in other countries, and then have done some work maybe with the firm over the summer or whatnot. I think and networking is obviously huge. And I know it's hard to network because people are busy, but you just kind of got to keep pushing, because if you find someone who has a knowledge of people in firms or other organizations in the States, trade associations are great places to look as well, I think. Then, hopefully you can kind of get it in. You might not, sometimes the best way to start to get a foot in the door is trying to work, I know, unfortunately unpaid, or trying to work on a clerkship basis or a fellowship basis. That's actually my first job out of law school. I worked as a law clerk for the governor's office of Ohio. And I'm also from Ohio. I don't know if that's where you're from, but
I am too.
oh, really?
Yeah.
Okay, there you go. So apparently this is something that's common for Ohio people. But I mean, those things are always steps in the door. And when you get your foot in the door, and you get to know more people, it's always can help lead to another job. So I guess, I don't know if that's really answers, but that's maybe some advice.
Well, I'll speak to that, being from Indiana, to diversify.
There you go.
But I came to USTR from an international organization. I was working at the Permanent Court of Arbitration in The Hague. And there, my work was entirely separate from trade, right? It was not too far afield. It was investment arbitration largely, but also state-to-state arbitration. The PCA does all different sorts of arbitration involving state parties. So it doesn't have to be, it can be a border dispute, or it could be a human rights issue. The diversity of cases really is wide. But that being said, I think it depends. In response to the question specifically, I think a lot depends where physically you want to be, and then what sort of experience you're looking for. For me, what I feel like I've been able to contribute coming into USTR was I learned things like countervailing duties and things that are very, very new to me, is the skill set does translate a bit. So at least in some of the work that I'm doing now, arbitration is a big part of that, right? The WTO, the dispute settlement body, draws upon some of that part of my former life. So to be able to tell future employers, again, to the questioner, what is it that you can bring from the OAS and these other experiences that will contribute to the work that they're doing in whatever area it may be, and Emily's mentioned many different ways that you might contribute, I think that will be the critical component. At least it felt that way for me. So how about in the room here? Questions? Let's go here, and then we'll go here.
If you don't have substantive experience in international trade, but maybe like experience in government or experience at a firm, and you're trying to parlay those skills or articulate them in a resume or interview, how have you been able to do that, or how would you suggest doing that?
I'll say at Justice, having an international trade or customs background is good. I mean, it's definitely a positive, but in terms of being just a commercial litigator, we would look at those skill sets as well. So even if you didn't have the subject matter expertise, if you wanted to come into the Department of Justice and you had just strong litigation background, they would look at that highly. And in fact, in my office in New York, it's very common to hire people who have no subject matter connection, but just are strong litigators. So I think it's definitely, there's different skill sets depending upon where you decide to apply. And I think that's what makes international trade very unique, in that there's this intersection of so many different industries and subject matters that depending upon what skill set you do have, there's likely an intersection with trade somewhere that you can apply your skills.
So articulating them in the resume, you show the litigation experience you've had, or have someone speak to that. Is that?
Yeah, I mean, when I was applying, I think I had like 5 or 6 different resumes that focused on different skill sets depending upon the job that I was applying for. So if to the extent I wanted to do a more litigation-focused job, my resume put those skill sets right up front, versus if it was going to be a more policy-based international trade job, then maybe I would put those types of skill sets first, depending upon what I was placing the emphasis on. So as you do apply to different jobs, keep that in mind. I definitely think you should have different versions of your resume at the ready, depending upon the job that you are seeking.
Anyone else want to jump in on that?
He's right.
Kate?
I guess it's sort of a two-part question. I know obviously the U.S. U.S. trade obligations do not change until the United States signs up as treaties, that kind of stuff. But do you find that your jobs evolve, the emphasis of your jobs evolve based on the economic situation, and or based on whether it's an election year, who was just elected, who just was kicked you're out of office, that sort of stuff? Do you find your jobs change over the years based on factors like these, or is it just everyday kind of enforcing agreements?
Oh, well, commerce, no. The answer is no.
Sorry, just to repeat the question for those who might not have heard, the question was, do your jobs, your either day-to-day work or the overall work of your office evolve with the times, and specifically with the economy or with the political administration at the time of the election and so forth?
It has not for us. In fact, I started under Clinton just for a little period of time. Then I've been under the entire Bush. Now I'll be under the entire Obama regime. And as it is, there's been no change with regards to what we focus on and what we work on. The only thing that I would say that has changed in the 14 years I've worked there is China has become this behemoth, which it was not 14 years ago. We had a few Chinese cases, but not that many. Today, it's the overwhelming cases. And that's because China is the overwhelming amount of global trade today with the United States. Because of that, the focus and so much of what we do has changed as a result of that enormous element being thrown into the pile. But that had nothing to do with politics. That just had to do with the winds of trade. And I think that's probably true on the customs side too, right?
Yeah. It doesn't change no matter who's up there. The time everything changes is when a massive piece of legislation comes through. Like, and the ninth thing was NAFTA and the MOD Act.
How about on the private side, Emily?
Yeah, on the private side, I would say more so with export work, especially with sanctions. Sanctions change right now with the Russia situation. There's changes happening practically daily. I don't do a lot of sanctions work, but I know our sanctions field, our sanctions attorneys have been getting, they are working around the clock, updating clients. Russia, any work that any clients have in Russia right now is on high alert, and there's always questions coming in. People who are looking to go into Russia are now having to do extra due diligence work, having to do, just understanding what is covered and what is not covered. So I think sanctions work, especially export control reform, just is still occurring for people in a lot of understanding. And this actually goes back to the first question, and Scott mentioned, there's lots of jobs that don't require a law degree. Export control work is huge with defense contractors. So any sort of defense good is licensed by the state, or if it's a dual use, which means it has a commercial or a military aspect to it, is licensed. And this isn't my forte, but this is my general understanding of this area of the law. It is licensed by Commerce. And a lot of our clients that we work with are export compliance managers who do not have law degrees, but it is a huge area of the law. It is also a really big area of the law because my understanding is Justice and other agencies are looking drastically at big contractors who are doing work and potentially sending goods to countries where they shouldn't be, or to people who they shouldn't be, or they're not licensed correctly. A lot of huge companies have had $1 million fines because of this. So this is a huge area of the law, and it certainly is an area that's always changing because of export control reform, sanctions, and it also doesn't require a law degree necessarily. So
the good thing about that area too, right, is that all the big companies hire people on staff that do export control. Lockheed Martin, GE, all of them, right?
Yeah, we've come across several companies that they focus so much more on export work, and we're hoping that they focus more on import work because obviously it's just as important. But a lot of these big companies, especially these big defense contractors, are really export control violations really scare them, I guess is a good way of putting it, which rightfully so, because it's a national security issue. It's something that I think the president and government in general pays a lot of attention to. So yeah, you're right. There's companies have this type of staff on hand. Usually the big companies do.
Which means there's jobs.
Yeah, I'll just add, for lawyers and non-lawyers, another area to pursue career opportunities is with the consulting firms. PricewaterhouseCoopers, Deloitte & Touche, all the big four have global trade services that both hire lawyers and non-lawyers alike to do this advisory type work, both with the export side and import side. So depending upon what skill set you bring to the table, there's a lot of opportunity within the consulting world.
I was just going to say that.
What's that?
I was just going to say that. We had somebody who went to PwC, and she doesn't do a lot of. Years ago she went to. She doesn't do a lot of. She didn't require to have a law degree, but she said some of the people she worked with in their compliance don't have law degrees.
I saw a hand waving. Oh, Wes, yeah, online.
Yeah, so what would you recommend for students who are still in law school but are at a law school that does not have a strong international program? What can they be working on to develop their skills while they're there?
This goes back, you were mentioning a little bit of the litigation side. I don't know if there's a non-litigation aspect that you'd also focus on.
Yeah, I think aside from litigation and writing, the two ways that you could also make yourself more marketable is become focused in a geographic area of the world. Like if you're a China specialist, or if you have some sort of connection to a region, Latin America, whatever. If you can get a focus that way on a geographic region, that's helpful. And also having a language skill that supplements whatever region that is. Makes you highly marketable. I think Kathleen can maybe speak to this because her language skills are definitely an asset at the place that we work today.
Other views?
I think besides international trade classes, because not every law school has them, we do focus. I mean, that's obviously key when we're looking at a candidate. But if they don't have those, we look at admin law. You got to take admin law classes. Even if you don't want to work in what I do, you want to work in the customs side or anything else, admin law is key. And I know a lot of law schools require that now, but not all of them do. I think admin law, and I also really appreciate it when I see intellectual property, because a lot of the ideas and principles behind antitrust and intellectual property, that we find them, the whole competitive nature of the law does at least bleed into what we do. Elements too. But all that aside, and all that's important, I do think writing is the key. And the more writing intensive classes you can take, perhaps the more you can get published, if not necessarily in your journals, but in external journals, because I know people that have done that too outside of their law school. That makes such a big difference because it really shows you are serious about the research and writing aspect of law school.
I just wanted to make another plug too for the summer experiences and other opportunities to spend a semester with an organization or an agency or being a summer associate at a firm for both the substantive knowledge that you would get if your school does not have a strong program in this area, but also the connections that would be made because that I think is invaluable, those summer and semester long experiences to the extent that you're able to do something like that. And there are a lot of individual grant programs, and sometimes law schools will provide funding, particularly perhaps if there's not a strong program and you express an interest to law school administrators, they would say, oh, well, that's a gap in our curriculum. That let us help you pursue that by helping fund your summer experience at the WTO or something like that. So that's just another thought from my side. Other questions? We're running out of time here, but we can have time for one more. Burning question?
I'll plug work study as well, by the way. When I was in my third year of law school, I did work study with the U.S. Attorney's Office. And I know most government agencies, do take volunteer attorneys, but also explore whatever work study opportunities that your local law school has. So I was able to, pursue work that way without having to place the economic burden upon the agency. That was another.
I mean, it's not the question, but I wanted to
Go,
make a little plug.
Yeah,
when people come to me and ask for careers in international law, and maybe it's all in this booklet that you were talking about. But I always tell folks, look, of course you're going to focus on commerce and you're going to focus on USTR and customs, but people tend to forget that ag has an international trade component. And I've talked to people at ag that say, yeah, they do not get as many applications as we do. Just because people don't think of them in that term. Then there's trade and development. They're over in Roslyn, right? And nobody thinks about them. And there's USAID, and there's a big trade component in USAID. But again, people don't think about them.
Development program, commerce, international, and FAA, and Department of Transportation.
OPEC.
We did a panel here at ASIL almost a year ago now called Not Just State that was entirely about international law and other U.S. agencies. And it's online if you don't want to watch it for free. But yeah, there's a lot of other opportunities.
And I think that's really important because I think most people don't know that, right? And I think most people, they come, they only apply to certain places and they throw up their hands and say, forget it, there's no career for me in international trade. But I know lots of people that have gone through ag had a great time because ag's a big deal in trade. It really is. And energy is another one huge.
Yeah.
Exactly.
And there's so many agencies, and obviously Robert could speak to this, but there's a lot of agencies that customs is the enforcer of, the import laws for. And, for instance, I've done work with Fish and Wildlife for whenever you're importing a good that has a CITES protected species in it, which can be something like wood that comes like a wood that comes from a protected tree. Elephant ivory is huge right now because there's a new order that the director just issued from Fish and Wildlife Service. So that's an agency that has import implications. FDA, I think, is a really big one because any sort of drug that's imported or medical device, they have a lot of restrictions around them that CBP helps administer. TTB, the agency in charge of enforcing not only tobacco but alcohol import laws. We've done cases with people who've imported alcohol and been subject to review. So there's so many agencies that have an import aspect to them, and I think most of them would probably have at least some sort of an import office. Obviously, it's not going to be as big as CBP or any of the export or commerce, but there are those connections, and USDA, like you said, is a huge one because obviously anything coming in is subject to a lot of either licenses or restrictions of some sort.
Thanks for those thoughts. Well, with that, I would like to just take a moment to thank folks online for joining us, because for you, we have to say thanks and see you. And for those in the room, thank you very much. And now we'll be able to have an opportunity to join the distinguished panel over some snacks. So we invite you to come stay and ask any further questions you have. They'll be here to speak to you, and are happy to do that. And thank you so very much to each of you, most of all, for taking the time again out of your schedules and to sharing your wisdom with us. So thank you.
Thank you.
So why do you rent in New York? Or you actually
I rent in both, but I'm subletting in New York right now.
I was wondering, like, how hard is finding a place in New York?
Yeah, it's getting kind of expensive. But it's been a good opportunity, and it's a way to diversify what I've done already.
Oh, yeah, definitely. No doubt about that. It's just that I know the real world kind of bumps against you when it comes to those costs.
Yeah.
And I'm like, is at least Justice paying for that?
No. I've had one thing to rent. I'm subletting, but there's a lot of just transition costs of moving and things like that, and I'm not getting the full amount for my rent because I still have a lot of material, all of my beds up there and all my clothes are still up there. So I have a friend who's actually staying there. It's gonna. Thank you so much. Sure. Thanks for your help.
No problem. Thank you. So when did you say you go back next week?
November 1st is my last day.
I guess you're probably excited to go back and see all your old friends.
Yeah, I mean, it's sort of it's a tough transition because we're just thinking of things right now at USTR, and so I don't want to leave that experience. But like I said, I think we're going to try to work out a way where I can transition back to some career.
Cool.
That'd be awesome.
So we'll maybe you get to Geneva. Have you been to Geneva yet?
No, I've been elsewhere. I've been to Guatemala a lot, but
That's not bad at all. Actually, that's awesome.
It's USTR provides a good opportunity for travel. So.
That's awesome. I'm so jealous people who get these details. I'm like a kidder.
Yeah, you definitely need to talk with the head office because there should be opportunity for that.
No matter how much I talk, our boss is the one that's the final say. Yeah, he's retired.
Yeah, I mean, I know that a lot of there's a lot of business councils that have U.S. Such and such country business council, and they do consulting work. Another big, really Salem Travis is a big international consulting firm. Salem Travis. Maybe just send me your resume. It might be the best. I just like to look at it to see if there's anything else I think of, or if there's anyone that can recommend me to. Because I just have a hard time getting in touch with my
but everything is the same.
And so where's your original JS? I think there's a lot of I mean, I know several a lot of firms like W2 practice groups do a lot of work on W2 and obviously working on these international cases at the WTO in Geneva. So I know that's an area we're trying to kind of break into more. We have some new discussions recently who worked in the WTO in Geneva. But I know that the World Bank is possibly doing something where they're helping countries to provide trade facilitation that's
actually facilitation job from the World Bank. Also projects for the past 2 years. But the issue with the World Bank is that they have some sort of higher fees. Some sort of structural changes. But yeah, we still have countries now. I don't think
No, I mean, I think if you send me your resume, I'll have a better understanding. And I could probably send you just get some advice from someone who has a little more knowledge, because some of my people who work in my practice group, they do a lot of international trade work with on behalf of sovereign nations. So they do a lot more the WTO type work and the economic development work and the trade policy work.
But it was more on the
I'll send you an email. Thank you so much. No problem. Nice meeting you too.
Oh, yeah.
So do you know, John?
Yeah. John, yes.
And you know Dan?
Yeah, yes.
Yeah.
I just finding out he signed up on Panelist. I inherited from him.
Oh, really?
Years ago, yeah.
Oh my goodness! Wow, that was
Yeah, I looked at him. He did. I was like,